Okay, thank you very much. And yeah, thank you very much, especially to Henrik and also to Alex and Ekaterina, who've done an amazing job of organising this. As an invited speaker, everything's been very smooth. I had all the information. It's really great. Thank you. I also wanted to preface my talk by saying that I am a psychologist, I'm not a clinician, and so my focus and my research questions are very much around the sort of cognitive processes that underlie some of these social cognitive abilities, and the sort of changes and differences that occur in autism spectrum disorders are interesting to me because they allow me as a test case really for some of those processes that I study in cognitive psychology. So what I'm going to focus on today is looking at self-other distinction in autistic and neurotypical adults, and obviously this is part of a larger program of work around sort of perspective taking and social cognition. So self-other distinction refers to this ability to understand that there's a distinction between our own and other people's body, our actions, our mental states, emotions, and so on. And the ability to distinguish these self and other processes is a really important part of our ability to interact with other people, but also in terms of sort of maintaining a stable sense of our own self-concept. We know that as humans, one of the most remarkable things that we can do is that we can not only understand our own mental states and bodily and other actions, but we can also simulate and imagine those of other people. So we can do this through this sort of sensory motor simulation. When we're watching other people perform actions, the brain reacts as if we're doing those actions ourselves. And also we sometimes see some of those empathy sort of responses when we see other people in pain. So when we can do this really efficiently, then we have a really good sense of self and other distinction. But there becomes then difficulties when those two things become conflated. And that can work in two directions. So firstly, we can be too focused on ourself, and therefore we have a difficulty in trying to imagine how other people might feel differently from what we know or how we feel about things. So we would call that an egocentric bias. So we're focused on our own perspective and view of the world. But we can also have a rigid focus on the other person, and that means then that we are struggling to distinguish between the self and other, and assume then, start to assume emotions and states and actions of other people. And for example, that can lead to, especially amplified in disorders like personality disorders and so on. So we know from research using neuroimaging methods that there's a large amount of the social brain network which is activated when we're engaging in these sorts of self-other distinction processes. And it's been suggested that this temporoparietal junction is one of the sort of key hubs of the brain that is responsible for this sort of more domain general processing of self and other versions of the world. Now, what's important about the temporal-parietal junction is it's not only implicated in self-other distinction, it's also active when we're engaging in a whole range of other sort of social, cognitive, theory of mind, perspective-taking tasks. But it's also engaged when we have to use other sort of related cognitive concepts. So that includes things like language processing, orienting our attention towards particularly important information, and also episodic memory, so recalling important information for us. And the other important thing about the temporoparietal junction is that the amount of activity and the overlap in that brain activity differs when we're thinking about other people according to how similar we see those other people to ourselves. So when that person is particularly similar, it has a greater degree of overlap with our representation of the self in that brain area compared to when those people are different. Now, from a more cognitive psychology perspective, we know that you can prompt people to think about self or other perspectives in a range of different ways. So we can either give people explicit cues. We might say, for example, just a prompt of saying self or other, so an explicit direct instruction of whose perspective to take. We can also use pronouns in language to make people think about different perspectives. But we can also implicitly encourage people to think about other people's perspectives, things like eye gaze, pointing, gestures, and so on. And what we know is that once you've prompted people to think about a particular self or other perspective, that changes the way the cognitive processes activate to think about those particular things. So, for example, in language comprehension research, it's been shown that when you read a sentence that includes a personal pronoun, such as I, then what happens is that you embody that event and you activate a simulation of the event as if you are the protagonist. So from an internal perspective. So you imagine you were doing the thing. And in contrast, then, if you read a sentence that involves a third person pronoun, he is slicing the tomato, then you imagine it the other way around, as if you're the observer of someone else performing an action. So we simulate these things and in real time. We also know that there is a distinction and particularly a preference towards the self-interpretation of events on memory. So in these sorts of tasks, participants are instructed to encode information, in this case, items in a shopping basket, either as belonging to the self or belonging to somebody else. And what you find is that people are better at recalling the items that have been encoded according to the self-ownership. And we also see self-reference effects on more sort of perceptual processes. So, for example, in shape recognition, so perceptual decisions about shapes, people are better and faster at recognizing those shapes when they've previously been paired with a self label compared to when they've been paired with an other label. And also we see a familiarity effect there, where similar other labels are better remembered and faster remembered than things with a different other label. Now, what's interesting then, from my perspective, it's looking at self and other processing in autism. And that's because autism, as we all know, has characterized by these profound difficulties with social communication and interaction, as well as these more repetitive and restricted behaviors and interests. So a more rigid thinking style and a lack of flexibility. Now, these sorts of core characteristics of autism represent themselves in sort of social cognitive tasks or behaviours in terms of difficulties with imagination, mentalising, theory of mind, metacognition, as well as perspective taking. And some of that is suggested is because of a difficulty in actually simulating other people's mental states or other people's actions and behaviours. So quite a lot of research has looked at trying to understand how self-other processing might be different in people with autism. And there's quite a lot of that evidence which suggests that actually the self-other distinction might be diminished in autism. So in these studies, typically then participants have used the memory encoding task, such as this shopping one, and have found that autistic adults have a reduced self or absent self-reference effect. So that is that they don't show this preferential memory recall for items that have been encoded according to the self. And also that those self-reference effects, or the size of those, are correlated with the number of autistic traits that those individuals hold. So this suggests then that maybe there is an atypical self-representation in autism, and that they then don't have this preferential automatic encoding of self-referential information. In contrast, though, there is other evidence which has suggested that actually the self-reference effect is undiminished in autism, that actually people with autism do activate these similar sorts of self-reference effects as neurotypical adults. And in these studies, then they've typically used perceptual binding tasks with a shape label and shown that they're able to activate these same sorts of preferences, and that they can do that even when they're using particularly complicated, for example, unfamiliar face stimuli. So what researchers have suggested is that maybe it's not the self-reference itself which is diminished in autism, but it's a more general process about memory, which is causing the difficulty in these other memory-based self-reference effects. Now, recently, researchers have started to wonder whether thinking about and taking the perspective of other people actually changes the way that we think about the self. And in these studies, then, the idea is that by thinking about other people, because you have to think about other people, you start to simulate the self, that those two things become sort of muddled up, and therefore you change the way you think about the self because you've incorporated aspects of that other person. So researchers have started to look at the extent to which that they call simulated induced malleability occurs in neurotypical populations. So in a typical task, what happens is that participants complete 3 sort of phases of the experiment. Firstly, they do a baseline of themselves. So they rate themselves on a range of different, it can be traits, experiences, knowledge, physical characteristics, and different things. So they baseline have to say, how would I feel in this particular situation? And they rate themselves. Then they go through 2 blocks where they're thinking about other people. So imagine another person, and this could either be a friend, so in this case James, or it could be the average person. And so they have to rate how they think those people would feel in those situations. And then they come back again for the final post-simulation phase, where they again have to reflect on their own experiences and their own memories of how they felt in those situations. So what researchers do is that they then look at the ratings that participants give at baseline and at post-simulation, and they see how different they are from the ratings participants gave in that middle section compared to either the similar or the different or the average other. And what they find is that the difference between the self and the other person gets smaller after they've simulated this other person. So suggesting that there is this simulation-induced malleability of the self, that people have updated their representation of the self or their memories of the self in these particular situations to more closely reflect what they think the average or the other similar person would feel. So across a range of different studies, this effect of simulation-induced malleability has been quite well replicated, and it's been suggested that, firstly, these sorts of simulation-induced malleability is very robust when you're thinking about your own memories, so when you have to recall some personal relevant information and how you felt about that. Also, when you're thinking about your own personal traits, so how friendly you think you are, how sociable you think you are, and so on. But it doesn't occur if you're having to think about your physical characteristics, so how blue are your eyes, or how long is your nose, and things. So it's very much a sort of social memory-dependent effect. The other important aspect of this is that these simulation-induced malleability effects occur at a conceptual level. So there's various ways I want to explain what that means. So firstly, it's not just a sort of priming effect in that you've just rated something and therefore you just remember it. Actually, what happens is that these simulation effects only activated when you've internally generated the other person's memory. So that means if the computer tells you, you know, John feels happy, this much happiness in this particular situation, rather than you decide how happy does John feel in that situation, you don't get the simulation-induced malleability. So it has to be internally generated. It's also been shown that if you use sort of synonyms for the same words, then you get the exact same effects. So simulation-induced malleability for the concept of a particular trait or experience. And it's also been shown that these same simulation-induced malleability effects carry over up to about 48 hours after simulation. People haven't tested beyond that. So it's quite a long-lasting effect of thinking about other people's perspectives, changing your own view of the self. The one controversial thing in this field is whether these simulation effects are actually greater for similar versus average other people. So the original studies suggested that you had a larger change in your simulation of the self after compared to the similar, compared to the average. And they explain that because when you have to simulate a similar person, you activate more of the self than you do when you activate an average person. And so they suggest then that that's why you get a larger effect, a larger change in the self, because you've activated more of the self alongside the similar. Subsequent studies, and you'll see in my own ones, have struggled to replicate exactly that similarity effect. Okay, so these studies have been done, all of them have been done on neurotypical populations, and so it's unknown whether the same sorts of simulation malleability might emerge in autistic adults. So effectively, that's what we were interested to look at. So just to be really clear, so the research questions I'm going to talk through is firstly whether we could replicate these same simulation-induced malleability effects using large adult samples. Secondly, we wanted to try and flip the paradigm a little bit to look at a second type of this simulation. And this time then what we wanted to look at is whether thinking about the self actually changes how you think about other people. So I'll explain what we did there. But the idea is that you can become more similar to somebody else by changing how you think about things to be more like them. But equally, you can make yourself more similar by changing how you think other people are to make them more similar to you. So we looked at both sides of that. The third thing then is that we wanted to look at how these self and other simulation effects might be influenced by autistic traits in a continuous neurotypical population, but also about how they might differ with autism spectrum disorder. And the reason we were interested in that is because there's sort of contrasting predictions that you could make about what would happen. So on the one hand, if autistic adults have a less well-encoded, a less flexible, less strong sense of the self, then they might be more open to malleability of the self, more open to changing based on incoming information. But in contrast to that, it may be that they would be less malleable because they're less socially motivated and less likely to try and change their own behaviours to try and fit with the sort of social context that they're in. So there's a lot of research suggesting that. So we were interested to see whether these were comparable and also then to test whether these similarity effects would also be comparable between the different groups. So that's come up a bit weird, but just to explain, so again, we replicated that design from the original Mayer and colleagues study, where there were 3 phases to the experiment: a baseline phase where participants first had to recall some memory of a particular situation that they were in, and they had to then say how they felt in that situation. They rated it on a scale from it was 0 to 100, but there were no numbers on the scale so that they couldn't simply remember the number that they last gave. They then went through an other simulation phase, which consisted of 2 blocks, one for similar others that they had to say who that similar other was, and one for an average other person target, rating some of the same items again, and the order of those was counterbalanced. And then finally, there was this post-simulation phase where they again had to reflect and score themselves on those same situations and how they felt. So the self-reflection task was very similar to that, but we flipped it around so that they first had to rate how the other people would think and feel in these different situations, and that was our baseline. In the middle then, there was this self-reflection phase where participants had to rate how they felt in these situations. And then finally, in the post-reflection phase, participants rated, again, how they thought the similar or average other person would feel in these. Half of the items were positively valenced, half of them were negatively valenced, and they were randomly allocated and counterbalanced across all of these orders. Okay, so in the first 2 experiments, we took an individual differences approach. So we were interested in looking across a large sample of neurotypical adults with a range of autistic spectrum traits to see how those traits might influence the existence of the simulation-induced malleability and self-reflection-induced malleability. So I guess the first thing we also needed to do is to replicate the effects to make sure they were robust and to check that this self-reflection also induced this same sorts of malleability. So the premise here then is that given that autism is a continuous scale and that traits vary across a neurotypical population, that we should be able to learn about how autism influences these sorts of behaviours just by looking in this neurotypical population. Just very quickly, in both experiments, or in all of these tasks, what happens is at the end of the task, you ask people, they not only choose who is to be their similar other, and that name appears in the task, but afterwards they rate how similar generally they think that person is to them, and also how similar they think the average other is to them, on a scale of 100. So what you can see here is that on a basic level, people rated the similar person as more similar, so these scores of 78, compared to the average other person who they rated around 50. Right, so before I put the data up, I just thought it would be useful to explain how we do this. So like I said, people rate the how they felt in these different situations, and then we calculate a difference score. In this case, then experiment 1 simulating others, it's the difference of how they scored the other compared to the self in that middle task. And we looked at that in the baseline other compared to self and the post-simulation other versus self. So the smaller then the score that they get means that there's a smaller difference and therefore more similarity between the two people. Okay, so what you can see is firstly there was a hugely significant effect of time. So that is that after people had reflected and simulated the self, that they were more likely, after they'd simulated the other person, they rated themselves as more similar to the other person. So again, replicating this effect that when you simulate somebody else, it changes the representation that you have for yourself to feel more similar to that other person. Importantly, we found that across both the average other and the similar other, and there was no difference in the size of that simulation effect for either the average or similar other. So the next thing that we did was we wanted to see whether these simulation-induced effects differ according to number of autistic traits. So to do that, we calculated the simulation-induced malleability by looking then at that difference score, and we correlated that with individuals' autism quotient scores. So what you can see is that for the average other person, but not the similar other person, we had a significant correlation so that the simulation-induced malleability increased for that average other as autistic traits increased. But as I say, there was no difference in the similar other. So that would suggest that people with an increasing number of autistic traits are more likely to experience simulation-induced malleability, so greater change to the self after having simulated other people. Okay, so in the second experiment where we looked at that self-reflection, so the baseline was on other people, they then self-reflected on how they felt before finally doing the other people again. So again, what we found was there was an effect of time whereby thinking about the self changed the way people rated the other people. But here, importantly, the direction of that differed according to whether the person was an average or a similar other. So what we found was that when the person was average, after simulating the self, people felt more different. People felt that average other was even more different from the self. Whereas after they had simulated the self, they felt similar people were even more similar to them. So basically, thinking about the self enhanced your sort of representation of a similar other person, but made you feel more distant from the average other. Again, we looked at the correlations, and here the self-reflection induced malleability didn't have any significant correlation with autistic traits for either the average other or the similar other. Okay, so in the third and fourth experiments, we wanted to do a case-controlled approach. So what we had was we had participants who were either neurotypical or who had a diagnosis of autism, and we compared then at a group level how they differed in terms of their simulation-induced malleability in experiment 3 and also in their self-reflection effects. So you'll see that there were significant differences across groups in both samples. There were 2 completely independent samples, sorry, I should say that, and so was the last 2 experiments. So the autism quotients were significantly higher for the autistic compared to the neurotypical. Participants were also, in both experiments, more likely or rated the self as more similar to the similar other compared to the average other. But there was also a group difference on that. So the neurotypical people rated their similar other as being more similar to them compared to the autistic person. So the idea here then is to make sure that there isn't just a sort of phenotype effect, or whether there is a sort of correlational effect that's just driven by phenotypes, and whether actually these effects exist at a group level between neurotypical and autistic. Okay, so again, just to explain the plotting of the data, it's exactly the same. So smaller scores mean that there is a greater simulation after thinking about other people. And so plotting separately on the left for neurotypical and on the right there, autistic. Okay, so what we found is firstly a robust replication of that simulation-induced malleability effect, whereby there's an effect of time where people felt more similar to this other person after they had simulated them than they did before. Importantly, there was a difference overall between our two groups in terms of how they rated the other people. So that is that neurotypical people felt that the other people overall had more similar memories and reactions to those memories compared to the autistic people. And there was also an interaction with the group and the similarity effect. So that is that only the autistic group distinguished their similarity judgments for average and similar others, and the neurotypical people didn't distinguish in their memories the average and similar others. Now, importantly, just sort of skipping back here, what you can see is there's a significant effect of time. So there is a simulation-induced malleability effect in both groups and at each level of other. So both average and similar in both groups exhibited this simulation-induced malleability. So again, we looked at the correlations just across the whole sample to see again whether these autistic traits differed in terms of their simulation-induced malleability. We replicated that correlation such that the simulation-induced malleability increased with increasing number of autistic traits for the average other, but didn't differ for similar other. Okay, so self-reflection. So again, what we found, again, we replicated this effect whereby the thinking about the self changed the way that people thought about the other people. But importantly here then, we replicated this similar people feeling more similar to the self after simulating the self. But here we found just no difference between the pre and post scores for the average other person. So that is thinking about the self enhances that similarity you feel already for a similar person, but doesn't seem to change the way that you think about an average other. Again, neurotypical people rated the other people overall as having more shared knowledge compared to the autistic people. And again, only the autistic population distinguished between the average and similar others in terms of the way they rated them. But none of these modulated by time, which suggests that then it isn't the actual simulation that's affected by the autistic group difference. Okay, so again, we looked at the correlations, and again, for this self-reflection, we find no correlation between autistic traits and either the average other or the similar other simulation effects. Okay, so what we found is then across 4 experiments with 4 independent samples, we found evidence both to replicate this malleability of the self. So showing that when we think about ourselves, when we think about others, we change the way and the knowledge that we hold for ourselves. And similarly, then we've shown the reverse, that when you think about others, when you think about the self, that it changes the way you think about other people. And so we've shown that across 4 experiments, these robust effects. What's interesting is that in this self-reflection, that there is a difference in the way that self-reflection changes our representations of similar and average other people. And again, if we think about the sort of previous literature on this, it would fit with the idea that these effects are stronger for similar others, because if you've had to reflect on the self, then that activates more of the similar other who shares more of the same knowledge and beliefs and so on. And so you'd expect a greater difference, a greater change and improvement in that one. And I guess it remains open in the average other, but it's probably likely that there's no real change in that one. You need to try and understand that better. So importantly, what we found, contrary to any sort of predictions around mentalizing or difficulty stimulating is that both simulation-induced malleability and self-reflection-induced malleability are intact. There doesn't seem to be a sort of group-level difficulty in these things, and that is despite having these more rigid and more restricted sort of thinking styles and more global differences on social cognition. Overall, we found these effects that, despite the fact that both groups were invited to say any similar other that they wanted, they still rated those similar others as less like them or less similar to them compared to the neurotypical group. So there seems to be a sort of basic difference there as well. But interestingly, it was the autistic adults who showed this strong distinction between the person they identified as similar to them compared to the average other person. So interestingly, across, I guess, 2 experiments, so the 2 that we looked at, this simulation-induced malleability, we found that actually autistic traits led to even more malleable sense of self. So that is, as people increased in the number of autistic traits that they had a larger effect, a larger change from baseline to post-simulation in terms of how they thought about the self. So perhaps this is because they have this weaker sense of self and other distinction, or weaker self-awareness and self-bias, but maybe actually they are just more flexible in how they apply these sorts of knowledge and judgments about the self and others. And so to try and unpack that a little bit more, I would sort of think about this in terms of sort of prediction based models of autism. So the idea is that people with autism have this sort of, or people with high numbers of autistic traits, because it's not a group level, likely then have difficulties with their predictive system. So what that means is that they have more difficulty in encoding predictions about the events that are happening around them based on their experience. They therefore have a confusion between the error signals that they receive when those predictions don't work, and then they have less concrete and less certain predictions going forward. So what happens is that they sort of address this uncertainty, because the predictions are not as strong, by sort of having more flexible predictions and being more susceptible to malleability of incoming information. So, for example, this new recent input. And it may be then that the reason that these sorts of self and other effects are more apparent in the sort of memory-based tasks is because the self-concept is less well consolidated into memory, and therefore less available, or less encoded and more available for that sort of change and malleability based on incoming information. And this sort of idea that flexibility might be more enhanced in autism is also consistent with findings from other work that we've done in my lab on, I won't say quite different sorts of concepts, but for example, we found that people with autism are more flexible in terms of how they use social stereotypes about social context from people's voices. So knowing whether it's a male or a female speaking, a child or an adult, an upper or lower class speaker, and they have more flexible predictions about what that person might be meaning or saying compared to neurotypical adults. Similarly, when we're looking at autistic adults and their prediction of counterfactual information in these fantastical narrative worlds, we find that autistic adults are earlier and show stronger prediction to counterfactual events, possibly because they have this sort of weaker encoded priors about what happens in the real life, that they're then more flexible about encoding novel imaginary events. And then the last thing that I really wanted to point out is that in lab-based tasks, largely effects on cognitive flexibility are very inconsistent, and actually largely showing there is no real consistent difference in autism versus neurotypical populations. I think this is sort of in stark contrast to what you see in real world experiences and what autistic people report about their real world experiences, where they say that they actually have real difficulty with flexibility and their sort of rigid and repetitive interests. And so I think there's some real work there to try and bridge that gap between the work that we're doing in the labs with these very tightly controlled cognitive tasks and bringing that into the real world and trying to understand then how these sorts of predictive models, and particularly how the sort of very specific situational predictions that we might need to make actually occur in the real world and predict people's behaviour. So that draws me to the end. I want to say thank you all for your attention, and thank you to all our participants. Importantly, thank you to Marcella, who is a PhD student who led on all of this work. So thank you.